The bullet tore through Rebecca's thigh as she ran through the narrow canyon pass, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life as she'd known it was over. Blood soaked through her split riding skirt as she stumbled against the rust-colored rock wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, she could hear the Dutton gang closing in, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. She'd witnessed their robbery of the Denver bank 3 days ago, had been in the wrong place at the worst possible time, and now they wanted her silenced permanently. Her mare had thrown a shoe 2 miles back, forcing Rebecca to continue on foot through this unforgiving Colorado terrain in the summer of 1883. She pressed her hand against the wound, feeling the warm blood pulse between her fingers. The pain was extraordinary, but fear drove her forward. Rebecca stumbled around another bend, her vision blurring at the edges. The canyon walls towered above her, offering no escape route, no salvation. She could hear the gang members calling to each other, their voices echoing off the stone. That's when she saw him. A lone rider sat atop a paint horse at the far end of the canyon, his silhouette dark against the brilliant blue sky. For a moment, Rebecca thought death had finally found her in a different form. But then the rider moved, spurring his horse forward at a controlled trot. As he drew closer, she could make out his features. A strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble, eyes the color of weathered denim beneath the brim of a dusty hat, broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. "Please," Rebecca gasped, reaching out toward him with her bloodied hand. "They're coming. The Dutton gang. I saw them rob a bank and now they want me dead." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of a man who lived in the saddle. His eyes swept over her, taking in the bullet wound, her pale face, the desperation in her green eyes. "How many?" His voice was low, steady. "5. Maybe 6. He nodded once, then moved to his horse, pulling a rifle from its scabbard. "Can you ride?" Rebecca tried to take a step and her leg buckled. The cowboy caught her before she hit the ground, one strong arm wrapping around her waist. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands that looked so weathered and rough. "I'll only slow you down," she whispered, hating the weakness in her voice, the tears that threatened to spill. Rebecca Grant had never been weak. She'd left Boston 2 years ago to make her own way in the West, had learned to shoot, to ride, to survive. But this bullet had stolen her strength. The cowboy looked down at her, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't pity she saw there, but determination. "Then we'll go slow together." Before she could protest, he lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. His left arm came around her waist, holding her secure against his chest, while his right hand held the reins. Rebecca could feel the solid warmth of him, could smell leather and sage and something uniquely masculine. "Name's Porter Hayes," he said, turning the paint horse back the way he'd come. "Hold on tight, Miss Rebecca Grant." "Well, Miss Grant, we're going to get you somewhere safe." The sound of pursuit grew louder. Porter urged his horse into a gallop, guiding them through a series of switchbacks that Rebecca hadn't noticed in her panicked flight. She bit her lip against the pain as each stride jolted her wounded leg, determined not to cry out. Porter's arm tightened around her, as if he could sense her struggle. They emerged from the canyon onto a high plateau dotted with scrub, pine, and juniper. Porter didn't slow down, navigating terrain that would have been treacherous even without a wounded woman in his arms. Behind them, shouts echoed from the canyon. The gang had reached the plateau. "There's a line shack about 3 miles north," Porter said, his breath warm against her ear. "Old mining shelter. Can you make it?" "I don't have much choice." She felt rather than heard his quiet sound of approval. They rode hard across the plateau, Porter constantly checking behind them. Rebecca's vision swam, darkness creeping in at the edges. She forced herself to stay conscious, focusing on the steady rhythm of the horse's gait, the strength of the arm holding her upright, the determination in every line of Porter's body. The line shack appeared suddenly, tucked into a fold of land that made it nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. Porter pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, then reached up to lift Rebecca down. Her legs wouldn't support her weight, and she sagged against him. "I've got you," he murmured, and then he was carrying her, kicking open the door of the small structure and laying her gently on a narrow cot against the far wall. The shack was sparse but clean. One room with a stone fireplace, a small table, a few supplies on rough-hewn shelves. Porter moved to the single window, scanning the landscape. Rebecca watched him through half-closed eyes, noting the confident way he carried himself, the quick intelligence in his movements. He wasn't panicking, wasn't cursing the bad luck of stumbling across a wounded woman with killers on her trail. He was simply dealing with the situation as it presented itself. "I need to see to that leg," he said, turning back to her. "This is going to hurt. Everything already hurts." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He moved to the shelves, pulling down a bottle of whiskey and some clean cloth that looked like old shirt material. Porter knelt beside the cot, and his hands were steady as he examined the wound. "Bullet went clean through," he said. "That's good. But we need to clean it and bind it tight." Rebecca nodded, gripping the edge of the cot. Porter worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound with whiskey that set her leg on fire. She gasped but didn't scream, didn't let herself make more than a small sound of pain. When he wrapped the cloth around her thigh, his touch was as gentle as possible given the circumstances. "You're tougher than you look, Miss Grant," he said, tying off the bandage. "You'd be surprised what a woman can endure when she has to." Porter met her eyes and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. He stood, moving back to the window. "They'll be here soon, they're tracking us." "You should go," Rebecca said, hating the words even as she spoke them. "Leave me here." You don't know me anything. They'll kill you if they find you helping me." Porter turned, and his eyes were hard as flint. "I said we'd go slow together, Miss Grant. I'm a man of my word." "But no buts. Now rest while you can. You're going to need your strength." Rebecca wanted to argue, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts to stay alert. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Porter Hayes standing at the window, rifle in hand, a silent guardian between her and the men who wanted her dead. She woke to the sound of voices outside. For a moment, Rebecca was disoriented, her head fuzzy and thick. Then memory rushed back, and with it fear. The light through the window was different now, slanted low. She'd slept for hours. Porter stood in the same position by the window, though he'd pulled a chair over at some point. His rifle lay across his lap, and his entire body was tense, alert. Rebecca started to sit up, and he glanced back at her, putting a finger to his lips. "Looking for a woman," a rough voice called from outside. "Dark hair, green eyes. She's wounded. We tracked her here." "Haven't seen anyone," Porter called back, his voice casual, almost bored. "Been here since yesterday, just me and my horse." "That's so." The voice was skeptical. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "Matter of fact, I do mind. This is private property." There was a pause, then the sound of multiple guns being cocked. "Wasn't really asking, friend." Porter stood slowly, keeping his rifle low but ready. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. There were too many of them. Even if Porter was fast, even if he was the best shot in Colorado, the odds were impossible. "You've got 5 seconds to step away from that door," the voice said. "Then we're coming in." Rebecca looked around desperately for a weapon, anything she could use. Her eyes landed on an old pistol on the shelf above her head. She reached for it, her wounded leg screaming in protest, and managed to grab it just as the door exploded inward. 3 men rushed through, guns drawn. Porter's rifle barked once, twice, and 2 men went down. The third got a shot off that splintered the doorframe near Porter's head. Then Rebecca fired, her hand steadier than it had any right to be, and the third man clutched his shoulder, stumbling backward through the door. "Get out!" Porter shouted, working his rifle with practiced speed. He fired again, keeping the remaining gang members pinned behind whatever cover they'd found outside. "All of you get out of here now, or the next shots won't be warnings." For a long moment, there was silence. Then the sound of retreating horses fading into the distance. Porter waited, unmoving, for a full 10 minutes before he finally lowered his rifle and moved to check the men on the floor. Both were dead, clean shots to the chest. He looked at Rebecca, who still held the pistol in shaking hands. "Good shooting. I've never shot anyone before." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. Porter gently took the gun from her hands. "You saved my life, that's all that matters. Those men were going to kill you, kill both of us. You did what you had to do." He knelt beside the cot, checking her bandage. "You opened the wound getting up. I need to rewrap it." Rebecca nodded mutely, trying not to think about the blood, about the 2 bodies on the floor, about how close they'd both come to dying. Porter worked quickly, his hands as steady as ever, though she noticed a slight tremor when he finished tying the new bandage. "We need to move," he said. "The rest of them might come back with reinforcements. Can you ride?" "I'll manage." "That's not what I asked." Rebecca met his eyes. "I can ride." Porter helped her outside, carefully avoiding looking at the bodies. His paint horse stood patiently where he'd ground-tied it. The 2 horses the dead men had ridden stood nearby, skittish but present. "We'll take one of theirs for you," Porter said. "Save my horse's strength." He helped Rebecca onto a sturdy bay gelding, then swung onto his own mount. "There's a town about 15 miles west, Salida. It's small, but they've got a doctor, a sheriff. We can get you properly tended and file a report about what happened." 15 miles, Rebecca repeated, trying not to show how insurmountable that distance felt. "We'll take it slow," Porter said, bringing his horse alongside hers. "We'll stop when you need to stop. No rushing." They rode out as the sun began to set, painting the Colorado sky in shades of orange and gold. Porter set a careful pace, checking on Rebecca constantly. She could feel her strength ebbing with each mile, but she refused to complain. This man had saved her life, had put himself in danger for a complete stranger, had killed to protect her. The least she could do was not burden him with her weakness. As darkness fell, Porter called a halt in a small grove of cottonwoods near a creek. He helped Rebecca down from her horse and settled her against a tree trunk, then set about making a small, sheltered fire. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said. "Give you time to recover some strength before we push on." "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said quietly. "I'm grateful, more than I can say, but you've already done so much." Porter looked at her across the fire, his face shadowed and mysterious in the flickering light. "Why'd you come west, Miss Grant?" The question surprised her. "I wanted freedom, independence. A chance to be something more than what Boston society would let me be." "And what did they want you to be? A wife? A decoration? Something to be displayed at parties and then tucked away when the real business of life began?" She laughed bitterly. "My father had it all planned out. Marry me off to some banker's son, produce grandchildren, host dinner parties, a life of quiet, comfortable suffocation. So you ran. I left. There's a difference." Rebecca pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I took the money my grandmother left me and bought a ticket west." I've been working as a bookkeeper for a freight company in Denver. Not glamorous, but it's mine. My life, my choices. Porter poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks drifting up into the night. I understand that, the wanting to make your own way. What about you? What's your story, Mr. Hayes? Porter, he said. Just Porter. And there's not much to tell. Been a cowboy since I was 16. Worked ranches from Texas to Montana. Save my money, move when I feel the itch, answer to no one but myself and the land. No family. Something flickered across his face. Had a brother once, Jacob. He died 5 years back, pneumonia. Since then, it's just been me. I'm sorry. He shrugged, but Rebecca could see the old pain in the gesture. Life in the West is hard. You learn to accept loss. They fell into silence, but it was comfortable rather than awkward. Rebecca watched Porter through lowered lashes, studying him in the firelight. He had a good face, she decided. Honest. The kind of face you could trust. She'd learned to read people in her 2 years out west, had developed instincts that kept her safe. And every instinct she had told her that Porter Hayes was a good man. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly. The truth. You could have ridden past, stayed out of trouble. Most men would have. Porter was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. My mother. She died when I was 12, but before she passed, she made me promise something. Made me swear I'd always help folks who needed it, especially women and children. She said the West was hard enough without good people turning their backs on each other. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was the best person I ever knew. He looked at Rebecca directly. When I saw you in that canyon, bleeding and terrified, I heard her voice in my head clear as day. Couldn't have ridden past if I'd wanted to. Rebecca's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. I'm glad you didn't. Me too, Porter said, and the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken. They rode on through the night, stopping frequently to rest Rebecca's leg. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, they could see Salida in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley where the Arkansas River ran clear and cold. The town was just waking up as they rode down the main street. Porter helped Rebecca dismount in front of a building with a sign that read, Dr. Samuel Morrison, Physician. He half carried her inside, calling out for the doctor. Dr. Morrison was a gray-haired man with kind eyes and capable hands. He took one look at Rebecca's leg and ushered her into his examination room, shooing Porter out with instructions to return in an hour. Porter found himself standing on the wooden sidewalk, suddenly at loose ends. He should go find the sheriff, report what had happened at the line shack. Should see to the horses, get them fed and watered. Should find a place to sleep, maybe get a meal. But instead, he found himself pacing back and forth in front of the doctor's office, unable to make himself leave. He'd known Rebecca Grant for less than a day, but something about her had gotten under his skin. Her courage, maybe, or her stubbornness. The way she'd kept going even when she was clearly in agony, the intelligence in her green eyes. The curve of her mouth when she'd almost smiled despite everything. Porter had spent years alone by choice, had turned away from every woman who'd shown interest because he valued his freedom too much to tie himself down. But Rebecca didn't feel like a tie. She felt like a possibility. He was still pacing when the sheriff found him. The man was tall and barrel-chested with a drooping mustache and a star pinned to his vest. You Porter Hayes? The sheriff asked. I am. Tom Bradford. Doc Morrison sent word about a wounded woman with a story about the Dutton gang. That right? Porter filled him in on everything that had happened, from finding Rebecca in the canyon to the shootout at the line shack. The sheriff listened, his expression growing darker with each detail. The Dutton gang has been a thorn in our side for months, Bradford said when Porter finished. Robbed banks from Denver to Leadville, We've got wanted posters on all of them, but they're slippery. You say you killed 2 of them. Self-defense. I don't doubt it. Frank Dutton isn't known for asking politely. The sheriff scratched his jaw. I'll ride out to the line shack, verify your story. Not that I think you're lying, but I need to see the scene. In the meantime, you and Miss Grant should stay in town. We might need you to testify if we catch the rest of the gang. How long? Few days, maybe a week. There's a boarding house 2 streets over, Mrs. Chen's place. Clean rooms, good food, reasonable rates. Porter nodded slowly. He'd been planning to move on, had a job waiting at her ranch up north. But the thought of leaving Rebecca now, while she was still hurt and the gang might still be after her, made his chest tighten. I'll stay, he said. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. You're a good man, Hayes. The West needs more like you. After Bradford left, Porter returned to the doctor's office. Rebecca was sitting on a chair in the waiting room, her leg freshly bandaged, looking pale but determined. What did he say? Porter asked, meaning the doctor. The bullet didn't hit any major vessels, but I tore the wound when I stood up to shoot. He says I need to stay off it for at least a week, keep it clean, watch for infection. She looked up at him. I heard you talking to the sheriff. You don't have to stay. I'll be fine here. You keep trying to get rid of me, Miss Grant. Rebecca, she said, if we're going to keep having this argument, you should at least use my given name. Porter felt a smile tug at his lips. The sheriff wants us to stay in town anyway in case they need us for testimony. I found a boarding house, Mrs. Chen's place. You'll need somewhere to rest while that leg heals. I can pay my own way, Rebecca said quickly. I have money saved. Didn't say you couldn't. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Porter felt that pull again, that sense of something shifting in his carefully ordered life. He'd been content with his solitary existence, or so he'd told himself. But maybe content wasn't the same as happy. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was exactly as the sheriff had described, clean, comfortable, and welcoming. The proprietor was a Chinese woman in her 50s who'd come west with her husband during the mining boom and stayed after he'd died. She took one look at Rebecca's pale face and injured leg and insisted on giving her the best room on the ground floor. You rest, Mrs. Chen said firmly, shooing Porter out. I bring food later. Good soup make you strong. Porter took a room on the 2nd floor and spent the afternoon seeing to the practical matters. Stabling the horses, buying supplies, sending a telegram to the ranch up north explaining he'd be delayed. He should have felt restless, trapped by circumstances. Instead, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Anticipation, maybe. That evening, Mrs. Chen invited both Porter and Rebecca to eat dinner with her in the boarding house kitchen. The meal was simple but delicious. Roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Mrs. Chen's garden. Porter found himself watching Rebecca as she ate, noting how color had returned to her cheeks, how she smiled at something Mrs. Chen said. You two make good pair, Mrs. Chen announced suddenly, looking between them with sharp, knowing eyes. He saves you, you save him back. That is good foundation. Rebecca blushed. Mrs. Chen, we barely know each other. I know my husband 5 days before we marry, Mrs. Chen said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Time does not matter when heart knows. Porter felt his own cheeks heat, but he couldn't entirely disagree with the older woman's assessment. There was something between him and Rebecca, something that felt both new and inevitable. After dinner, Porter helped Rebecca back to her room. She was moving better, though she still needed support. At her door, she turned to face him. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, Porter. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I meant what I said in the canyon. You could have left me and no one would have blamed you, but you didn't. You risked your life for me. That's not something I take lightly. He covered her hand with his own. I couldn't leave you, Rebecca. Didn't want to. The air between them felt charged, electric. For a moment, Porter thought about leaning in, about finding out if her lips were as soft as they looked. But Rebecca was injured, vulnerable. This wasn't the time. He stepped back. Get some rest. I'll check on you in the morning. Over the next few days, Porter and Rebecca fell into an easy rhythm. He'd bring her breakfast from Mrs. Chen's kitchen, and they'd eat together while she told him stories about Boston and her family, about learning to navigate life in the West. He found himself telling her things he'd never shared with anyone, about his childhood in Texas, about the brother he still missed, about the loneliness that sometimes crept up on him in the empty spaces between towns. Dr. Morrison checked Rebecca's leg every other day and pronounced himself satisfied with her progress. The wound was healing cleanly, no signs of infection. By the 5th day, she could walk short distances without assistance, though she still tired easily. Porter took her for walks around Salida, supporting her when she needed it, pointing out landmarks and introducing her to townspeople. The small community had embraced them both, viewing Porter as a hero for saving Rebecca from the Dutton gang. Several men had even asked Porter if he'd consider staying on permanently, maybe working as a deputy for Sheriff Bradford. You could do it, Rebecca said as they sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the Arkansas River flow past. Be a lawman. You've got the skills, the temperament for it. Never saw myself as the law, Porter said. Always preferred being free to move when the mood struck. And now, he looked at her. Now I'm not so sure what I prefer. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Rebecca's breath caught, and Porter knew she understood what he was really saying. That she'd changed something in him. That the life he'd been living suddenly felt incomplete. Rebecca began, but she was interrupted by the sound of rapid hoofbeats. They both looked up to see Sheriff Bradford riding hard down the main street, his face grim. The sheriff pulled up in front of them. "Hayes, Miss Grant, we've got trouble. One of my deputies just rode in from the east. The rest of the Dutton gang is headed this way, and they've picked up reinforcements. There's at least 10 of them now, and they're asking questions about a dark-haired woman and the cowboy who killed their friends." Porter was on his feet instantly. How far out? Maybe 2 hours, maybe less. Bradford looked between them. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. My town has good people, but we're not fighters. I've got 2 deputies and maybe a dozen men who can shoot straight. Against 10 hardened outlaws, our odds aren't good." "You're saying we should run," Rebecca said, standing up with Porter's help. "I'm saying you should consider it. These men want revenge, and they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire." Porter's mind raced. They could run. Take the horses and head into the mountains, lose themselves in the high country until the gang gave up and moved on. It was the smart play, the safe play. But it was also abandoning an entire town of good people who'd shown them nothing but kindness. Abandoning Mrs. Chen, who'd fussed over them like a mother hen. Abandoning Dr. Morrison, who treated Rebecca with such care. Abandoning all the ordinary folks who were just trying to live their lives in peace. "No," Porter said firmly. "We're not running." Rebecca looked at him. "Porter, the sheriff is right. 10 men, I know the odds. I also know that if we run, this gang will just keep terrorizing people. Someone needs to make a stand." He turned to Bradford. "I'll help. Tell me what you need." The sheriff's expression shifted from worried to determined. "I need you to help me organize a defense. You've got tactical experience. I can see it in the way you move, the way you think. If we're going to have any chance, we need a plan." "I'm helping too," Rebecca said. Both men started to protest, but she held up a hand. "I can shoot. You both know that. My leg is better." I won't be running across rooftops, but I can hold a position and aim straight. You need every gun you can get." Porter wanted to argue, wanted to lock her somewhere safe, but he could see the set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes. This was the woman who'd ridden 2 miles on a wounded leg with killers chasing her. She wasn't going to back down now. "Fine," he said, "but you're in a fortified position, somewhere with good cover and clear sightlines." The next 2 hours were a flurry of activity. Porter and Sheriff Bradford organized the defense of Salida with military precision. They positioned shooters on rooftops and in upper-story windows overlooking the main street. They created barriers using wagons and water troughs. They sent the women and children to the church cellar, the most protected building in town. Rebecca took up position in the second-floor window of the general store, a rifle in her hands and extra ammunition at her side. Porter checked on her 3 times before he was satisfied with her cover, making her promise to keep her head down. "I will if you will," she said, and he could see the fear in her eyes despite her brave words. Porter cupped her face in his hands. "Rebecca, if something happens, don't," she whispered. "Don't say it. Just promise me you'll be careful." He leaned in and kissed her, a brief press of lips that carried all the words he didn't have time to say. When he pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We'll finish this conversation later," he said. "You better make sure there is a later." Porter took up his own position on the roof of the boarding house, where he had a clear view of the eastern approach to town. Sheriff Bradford was in the street below with his deputies, ready to parley if possible, ready to fight if necessary. They didn't have to wait long. The gang rode into Salida just as the sun was reaching its zenith, 10 rough-looking men on horses that looked as mean as their riders. Frank Dutton was in the lead, a scarred man with dead eyes and a cruel mouth. "We're looking for a woman and a cowboy," Dutton called out, his voice carrying down the empty street. "The woman witnessed something she shouldn't have. The cowboy killed 2 of my men. Hand them over and we'll ride on peaceful like." "Can't do that, Dutton," Sheriff Bradford called back, standing in the middle of the street with his hand near his gun. "Those folks are under my protection. You want them, you'll have to go through me and every man in this town." Dutton laughed, a harsh sound. "That's so. Well, Sheriff, I count 10 guns on my side. How many you got?" "Enough," Bradford said simply. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Porter could see Dutton weighing his options, trying to spot the hidden shooters, calculating the risk. Then one of the gang members, a young hothead with more bravado than sense, drew his gun and fired. The shot went wild, but it was all the excuse anyone needed. The street erupted in gunfire. Porter took careful aim and fired, taking down the man who'd shot first. He worked his rifle with practiced efficiency, providing covering fire for the sheriff and his deputies. Around him, the townspeople of Salida fought with surprising effectiveness, their shots coordinated and deliberate. The gang had expected an easy target, a frightened town that would give up what they wanted to avoid bloodshed. Instead, they found themselves in a genuine battle. 3 more gang members went down in the first minute. The rest took cover, returning fire from behind their horses and the few structures at the edge of town. Porter saw Dutton circle around, trying to flank the defenders. He adjusted his position, tracking the outlaw leader with his rifle. But before he could fire, another shot rang out from the general store. Dutton jerked in his saddle, clutching his arm. Rebecca had winged him. Enraged, Dutton turned his horse toward the general store, firing wildly at the second-floor window. Porter's heart stopped. He could see Rebecca ducking behind the wall, could see the wood splintering around her position. He was moving before he consciously decided to, sliding down the ladder from the roof and running across the street. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet. Porter didn't care. All he could see was Dutton advancing on the general store, murder in his eyes. Porter tackled the outlaw leader off his horse, and they both went down hard. Dutton's gun went flying, and the two men grappled in the dirt. Dutton was strong and mean, fighting with the desperation of a cornered animal. He got his hands around Porter's throat, squeezing. Porter's vision started to gray at the edges. He could hear Rebecca screaming his name from the window above. With the last of his strength, he brought his knee up hard into Dutton's ribs. The outlaw's grip loosened just enough for Porter to break free. He drove his fist into Dutton's jaw twice, and the outlaw leader went limp. The gunfire was dying down. Of the 10 gang members who'd ridden into Salida, 5 were dead, 3 were wounded and disarmed, and 2 had fled into the mountains. It was over. Porter staggered to his feet, his throat aching where Dutton had tried to strangle him. He looked up at the general store window and saw Rebecca standing there, tears streaming down her face. "I'm okay," he called up to her, his voice hoarse. "I'm okay." She disappeared from the window, and moments later came limping out of the general store, her leg clearly paining her but not slowing her down. She threw herself into Porter's arms, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. "You idiot," she sobbed against his chest. "You could have been killed." "When I saw him choking you, I know," Porter said, stroking her hair. "I know, but I couldn't let him hurt you. I couldn't." They stood there in the middle of the street, holding each other while around them the town began to emerge from their defensive positions. Dr. Morrison was already moving among the wounded. Sheriff Bradford was securing the surviving gang members. Mrs. Chen was herding people out of the church cellar, checking to make sure everyone was accounted for. Miraculously, not a single townsperson had been killed. Several were wounded, but nothing that Dr. Morrison couldn't handle. It was as close to a perfect defense as they could have hoped for. That evening, Salida threw an impromptu celebration. Someone brought out a fiddle. Someone else produced jugs of homemade whiskey. Tables were dragged into the street and covered with food. The whole town turned out to celebrate their victory and honor their defenders. Porter sat at one of the tables with Rebecca beside him, her hand tucked securely in his. They hadn't spoken much since the battle, hadn't needed to. Some things went beyond words. Sheriff Bradford approached them, a glass of whiskey in each hand. He offered one to Porter. "That job offer is still open, you know. Town could use a man like you. Hell, after today, you could probably run for mayor and win." Porter glanced at Rebecca, trying to read her expression. "I've been drifting for a long time, Sheriff. Not sure I remember how to stay put." "Maybe you just needed a reason," Bradford said, his eyes twinkling. He nodded to Rebecca. "Seems to me you might have found one." After the sheriff left, Rebecca turned to Porter. "He's right, you know, the town wants you to stay. I heard at least 5 people make you offers today. Job at the livery, job at the sawmill, job helping build the new railroad spur." "What about you?" Porter asked. "What do you want?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "I came west looking for freedom and independence. I thought that meant being alone, not needing anyone. But these last few days with you, I've learned something. Being independent doesn't mean being solitary. It means choosing who you want in your life, rather than having others make that choice for you." Porter's heart was pounding. "Rebecca, I'm choosing you," she said, meeting his eyes. "If you'll have me. I know it's fast, I know we barely know each other in the traditional sense. But I've seen who you are in the moments that matter. You're brave and kind and stubborn and honorable. You kept me alive when I thought I'd die. You stayed when you could have run. You fought for a town full of strangers because it was the right thing to do." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not asking for forever right now. I'm just asking if you might consider staying in Salida for a while, see where this goes, See if what we have is real or just born of danger and circumstance. Porter lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. It's real, Rebecca. I've known it was real since I carried you into that lined shack, and you told me you'd only slow me down. I've never met anyone like you. You're strong and smart and brave and beautiful, and the thought of riding away from you makes me feel like I'm missing a piece of myself. So you'll stay. I'll stay, Porter said, for you, for this town, for the chance to see what we can build together. Rebecca's smile was radiant. She leaned in and kissed him, and this time it wasn't brief or chaste. It was deep and full of promise, full of all the possibilities ahead of them. Around them, the townspeople cheered and whistled. Mrs. Chen appeared at their side with a huge grin. I told you, she said triumphantly. Good foundation, very good foundation. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and joy. Porter took Sheriff Bradford up on his offer, accepting a position as deputy. The work suited him more than he'd expected. He liked helping people, liked being part of a community rather than just passing through. He was good at it too, bringing both his tactical skills and his steady temperament to the job. Rebecca's leg healed cleanly, and she found work as a bookkeeper for several of Salada's businesses. She had a talent for numbers and organization, and word spread quickly. Soon she was busier than she'd ever been in Denver, managing accounts for the general store, the sawmill, and even the town itself. They courted properly, or as properly as one could in a small frontier town. Porter took her on picnics by the Arkansas River. They went riding together through the mountain valleys, Rebecca's horsemanship improving with each outing. They attended church socials and barn dances. They sat on Mrs. Chen's porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing while the older woman smiled knowingly from her rocking chair. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Porter discovered that Rebecca had a wicked sense of humor and a talent for poker. Rebecca learned that Porter could cook surprisingly well and had a beautiful singing voice that he only revealed when he thought no one was listening. They learned each other's fears and dreams, their pasts and their hopes for the future. 3 months after the battle with the Dutton gang, Porter rode out to a meadow in the mountains, a place he'd discovered during his patrols. It was peaceful there, with wildflowers carpeting the ground and a view of the snow-capped peaks in the distance. He spent a day clearing a small area, gathering stones, and building something he hoped Rebecca would like. The next day, he asked her to ride out with him. Rebecca agreed immediately, as she always did when he suggested an adventure. They rode together through the autumn gold aspen groves, their horses moving side by side, Porter stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. When they reached the meadow, Rebecca gasped. In the center of the clearing, Porter had built a small stone fire pit surrounded by smooth river rocks arranged in a circle. Nearby, he'd laid out a blanket and a basket of food. It's beautiful, Rebecca said, dismounting. When did you do this? Yesterday, Porter said, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a teenager. I wanted to bring you somewhere special. They ate lunch and talked, and Porter found himself memorizing everything about the moment. The way the sun caught the copper highlights in Rebecca's dark hair, the sound of her laughter, the feeling of her hand in his. Finally, when he couldn't wait any longer, Porter stood and pulled Rebecca to her feet. There's something I need to ask you. Rebecca's eyes widened. Porter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't fancy, just a simple gold band with a small garnet set in the center, but he'd chosen it carefully from the general store's limited selection. Rebecca Grant, 3 months ago you stumbled into my life bleeding and terrified, and you've been changing it ever since. You make me want to be better, to do better. You make me want to stay in one place and build something lasting. You make me want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night." Porter dropped to one knee, and Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth. "I love you, Rebecca. I think I've loved you since you told me you'd only slow me down, and I told you we'd go slow together. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that choosing me was the right decision?" Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Porter slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. They kissed under the wide Colorado sky, and Porter felt something in his chest settle. This was home. Not a place, but a person. Rebecca was his home, and he was finally done wandering. They were married a month later in Salada's small church, with most of the town in attendance. Mrs. Chen cried through the entire ceremony. Sheriff Bradford served as Porter's best man. Dr. Morrison walked Rebecca down the aisle, having stepped into a fatherly role for the young woman so far from her own family. Rebecca wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Porter wore his best shirt and pants, his boots polished to a shine. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a 2-room cabin that they gradually expanded and improved. Porter continued his work as deputy, while Rebecca's bookkeeping business thrived. They became pillars of the community, the kind of couple that everyone knew and respected. Their first winter together was harsh, with snow piling up to the windows and temperatures dropping below zero. But they barely noticed, wrapped up in each other, learning the rhythms of married life. Porter taught Rebecca to make his mother's biscuit recipe. Rebecca taught Porter to dance properly, laughing as he stepped on her toes. Spring brought new life to the valley, and with it, news. Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She told Porter one morning over breakfast, her voice nervous but excited. Porter's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and protested. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We're going to be parents." Their son was born in early winter, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Jacob, after Porter's lost brother. Porter held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overcome with love and gratitude. "He's perfect," Rebecca whispered, watching her husband cradle their child. "You're perfect." "No," Porter said, leaning in to kiss her forehead, "but we're perfect together." The years that followed were full and rich. Porter was eventually elected sheriff when Tom Bradford retired, a position he held with fairness and integrity. Rebecca's business continued to grow, and she became known throughout the region for her financial acumen. She even started teaching bookkeeping to other women in town, believing firmly that every woman should have the skills to support herself if needed. Jacob grew into a bright, curious boy who followed his father around like a shadow and read voraciously with his mother. 3 years after his birth, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, who had Rebecca's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. The house was always full of noise and laughter, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of family dinners and lazy Sunday mornings. One evening, when Jacob was 7 and Sarah was 4, the family sat on their front porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The children were playing in the yard, chasing fireflies. Rebecca leaned against Porter's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Do you ever think about that day in the canyon?" she asked quietly. "About how differently things could have turned out?" Porter was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. Usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and my mind starts wandering. I think about what would have happened if I'd ridden a different path that day, if I'd been 5 minutes earlier or later, if I'd decided to mind my own business. Regrets? Not a single one. He tightened his arm around her. That was the day my real life started. Everything before was just prologue. Rebecca tilted her face up to kiss him. I love you, Porter Hayes. Thank you for going slow with me. Always, he promised, for as long as we both shall live. As the years continued to pass, Porter and Rebecca became one of those couples that the town looked to as an example. They weathered hard times together, droughts that threatened the ranchers, economic panics that strained businesses, illnesses that swept through the community. Through it all, they remained steadfast partners, supporting each other and supporting their town. Rebecca never forgot where she came from or how she'd found her way to Salida. She used her own money to help other women who came west looking for new starts, offering them work, advice, and friendship. She was particularly dedicated to helping women escape bad situations, remembering her own desperate flight through that canyon. Porter, for his part, became known as a lawman who believed in redemption. He was tough when he needed to be, but he also believed in giving people second chances when they'd earned them. More than one young man who'd made mistakes found guidance and support from Sheriff Hayes, who remembered what it was like to be young and uncertain about the future. When Jacob turned 18, he surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to go to college back east. Porter and Rebecca supported his decision, though it meant their boy would be far from home. They traveled with him to Denver, saw him off on the train, and held each other as they watched it disappear into the distance. He'll come back, Rebecca said with certainty. This is his home. We're his home. He just needs to see the world first. She was right. Jacob returned 3 years later with a law degree and a pretty young woman named Elizabeth who became like a daughter to them. He opened a practice in Salida, determined to bring justice and fairness to the region in his own way. Sarah, meanwhile, had inherited her mother's head for numbers and her father's sense of justice. She announced at 16 that she intended to become a banker, and neither Porter nor Rebecca saw any reason to discourage her. When she was 21, she did exactly that, taking over management of Salida's bank and running it with skill and integrity. Porter and Rebecca watched their children grow and thrive with pride and joy. They became grandparents when Jacob and Elizabeth had twins, and again when Sarah married a rancher named Thomas and had 3 children in quick succession. The house that had once felt so large with just 2 people now seemed to burst at the seams during family gatherings, filled with laughter and noise and love. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Porter took Rebecca back to the meadow where he'd proposed. It looked much the same, though the trees had grown taller and new wildflowers had taken root. The stone fire pit was still there, weathered but intact. They sat on a blanket just as they had all those years ago, older now but no less in love. Rebecca's hair had threads of silver, and Porter's face carried more lines, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they'd been that day in the canyon. "You remember what you said to me?" Rebecca asked, taking his hand. "When I told you I'd only slow you down." "I said we'd go slow together," Porter replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Best decision I ever made." "We've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best," Porter agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." They stayed in the meadow until sunset, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the town they'd helped build, about all the moments that had made up their life together. When the stars began to emerge, Porter helped Rebecca to her feet, and they rode home together through the twilight, side by side as they'd always been. The years continued their steady march. Porter eventually retired from being sheriff, passing the badge to a younger man he'd trained. Rebecca closed her bookkeeping business but continued to mentor young women in town. They spent their days gardening, reading, visiting with their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. One spring morning, when they were both well into their 70s, Rebecca woke to find Porter sitting on the edge of their bed, looking out the window at the mountains. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, reaching for his hand. "About that canyon," he said. "About seeing you there, terrified and bleeding, and knowing that my whole life was about to change." "Are you glad it did?" Porter turned to her, and his eyes were as warm as they'd been 47 years earlier. "Rebecca, you were the greatest adventure of my life, the greatest gift. Every moment we've had together, the joy and the sorrow, the easy times and the hard times, all of it. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the part where you almost got strangled by Frank Dutton," he laughed. "Even that. Especially that, because it proved to me how much you meant to me. How far I'd go to keep you safe." Rebecca shifted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "We built something good, didn't we? A good life, a good family." "The best," Porter agreed. "All because I couldn't ride past a woman in trouble. All because you were brave enough to keep fighting." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the mountains they'd called home for nearly half a century. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and built the best of lives. As they aged, their love only deepened. It became quieter, perhaps, less fiery and more steady, but no less profound. They moved slower now, their bodies no longer capable of the things they'd once done without thought. But that was all right. They'd promised to go slow together after all. Porter passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Rebecca holding his hand. The entire town turned out for his funeral, sharing stories of the brave, kind, honorable man who'd protected them for so many years. Rebecca sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her eyes dry despite her grief. "He wouldn't want tears," she told them. "He'd want celebration. We had 50 wonderful years together. How many people can say that?" She lived for 5 more years, staying active and engaged with her community, surrounded by family. She made sure every one of her grandchildren knew the story of how she'd met their grandfather, how he'd saved her life in more ways than one. On a warm summer evening, Rebecca asked her children to take her to the meadow one last time. They helped her onto a horse, and the family rode out together. When they reached the clearing, now marked with a small plaque commemorating Porter's proposal all those decades ago, Rebecca smiled. "This is where our life really began," she told them. "This is where your father asked me to be his wife. This is where we promised to go slow together." That night, Rebecca passed away in her sleep, a peaceful expression on her face. Her children found a letter she'd left for each of them, full of love and wisdom and stories. But the last line of each letter was the same. "Find someone who will go slow with you, who will stay when things get hard, who will choose you every day. That's what love is. That's what your father and I had. Don't settle for anything less." Rebecca was buried next to Porter in Salada's cemetery, under the shade of a cottonwood tree with a view of the mountains. Their headstone was simple, bearing just their names, their dates, and an inscription that Rebecca had chosen years earlier. They went slow together. In the years that followed, the story of Porter Hayes and Rebecca Grant became legend in Salada. It was told to children as an example of true love, to young couples as a model for partnership, to anyone who would listen as proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments we least expect. Their house still stood at the edge of town, home now to their great-grandchildren. The meadow where Porter proposed became a favorite spot for locals and visitors alike. And in the church where they'd married, couples still exchanged vows, often including a reference to going slow together, honoring the legacy of two people who'd found each other in the hardest of circumstances and built something beautiful that lasted. Jacob, true to his father's legacy, served as mayor of Salada for 20 years, guiding the town through the transition from wild frontier to established community. Sarah's bank funded countless businesses and dreams, helping the region prosper. Their children and grandchildren spread throughout Colorado and beyond, but they always came back to Salida, drawn by the roots their family had planted there. On the 50th anniversary of Porter's death, the town erected a statue in the main square. It depicted a cowboy and a woman standing together, her hand in his, both facing toward the mountains. A plaque at the base told their story in simple words: how they'd met, how they'd fought together, how they'd built a life and a legacy. The final line of the plaque read, "In honor of Sheriff Porter Hayes and Rebecca Hayes, who showed us that true love means choosing to go slow together, no matter what obstacles lie ahead." And so their story lived on, a testament to courage, to partnership, to the transformative power of love. They'd started as strangers in a canyon, a wounded woman and a wandering cowboy, and they'd become something greater than either had imagined. They'd become home to each other, and in doing so, they'd helped build a home for countless others. Their legacy wasn't just in the children they'd raised or the town they'd helped build. It was in the example they'd set, the proof they'd provided that sometimes the best path forward isn't the fastest one. Sometimes you need to slow down, to take your time, to choose the journey over the destination. Sometimes you need someone to say they'll only slow you down, and someone else brave enough to reply that they'll go slow together. And sometimes, that's exactly how you find your way home,